So we're going to talk about onboarding new tenants. And I know I probably say this all the time. Once again, for those of you that have just joined, if you have any questions, I would like some more participation and some more interaction. Please feel free to pop them in the chat box. You can direct them just to me directly if you're scared of people thinking that you are asking a silly question. So onboarding new tenants. I know that as I say, I probably say this every single time, but this is one of the most critical parts of the process of rental management. Because in the end, this is once again, and we spoke about this when we were talking about onboarding new landlords. Any new client onboarding process is you set the tone for the rest of that relationship. And, you know, tenant relationships can be fraught with problems. We are dealing with people in the end in this industry, and people are special and have their own personalities. And so sometimes it can be a bit challenging. So one of the things that I think we underestimate a lot, and not only us, but that is often underestimated, is communication. And making sure that we're all on the same page. Once again, and I do have the risk of repeating myself here, but we have to remember that we do this every single day of our lives. And so this is our business. And in the same way the tenants have their own business and their own area of expertise, this is our area of expertise. So what might seem trite to us and what might seem just logical to us is not logical to other people. Rentals, after all, can be rather tricky. So it's important for us to communicate as we go through this and make sure that there's no such thing as over communicating. And of course, those of you that have been on my training before know that I work on the philosophy of CYA, cover your ears. And that has to do with the fact that when anything goes wrong, there's only one person. Remember, we're in a sandwich. We've got the tenant on the one side, the landlord on the other side. We represent the landlord in the middle. And when anything goes wrong, we are the people that get blamed. So I say we cover our asses, and part of that has to do with doing things in writing, but that does not preclude us from talking. Talking, you know, you pick up the phone, and often I get messages over WhatsApp, for example, from agents asking me questions. And I just say, give me a call, because sometimes you need that interactive to make sure that everybody is on the same page. So the very first question is, when does onboarding start? Now, I'm just going to give you my definition in terms of where my process starts, okay? And I say that as soon as the application has been approved, then as far as I'm concerned, we are now in the onboarding process. We might not complete that process for some other reason as we go through the steps. You know, things might terminate, so to speak, as we go through the steps. But the reality is that is when we start the onboarding process. There is an argument that says, in a sense, we've started onboarding from the moment that we've met the applicants, we've had the inquiry, etc., etc. But that we've dealt with under property marketing and the property marketing SOP or checklist or whatever you want to call it. So in terms of the my processes, my standard operating procedures, as soon as an application has been approved, and remember, when we say an application has been approved, I'm talking about we've made a recommendation to the landlord. The landlord has accepted that recommendation, and we have conveyed that to the tenant. Then we start the onboarding process. And I do have a standard operating procedure, and let me just, hopefully all my setups that I set up are still working. Yeah, there we are, new tenant onboarding. As we go through this week and the following, remember we've broken this into 2 sessions. So as we go through the following session, I will be updating this and finalizing this, and then this will be available for purchase at the end of our series on tenant onboarding. I do believe in standard operating procedures, and that you know, we have so many things that are happening in our life every day. We get disturbed. People walk in, everything is most urgent. When something, you know, it can be something very simple, but it's urgent, we've got to drop everything. So it's very difficult to make sure to, you know, cross your T's and dot your I's. And as far as I'm concerned, the only way to do that is with a standard operating procedure. And I also build in the communication because I think that is absolutely critical. So the onboarding process, once we have conveyed to the tenant that the application has been approved, then as far as then I start the onboarding process. Okay, that's how my head works at least. And I know my head is a bit strange. When does the lease start? Now, this might be a bit weird because this training isn't about leases. However, leases are critical in this onboarding process because one of the things we're going to do is we're going to conclude a lease, or we're going to negotiate, conclude, whatever you want to call it, a lease between the landlord and the tenant. And it's very, very important. And we'll talk about this because I think this is one of the critical points here where we can often get ourselves into trouble. I almost said another word. Get ourselves into trouble because it's critical to know when that lease has actually been concluded. Okay, and there's a few factors that play a role, and I'm going to do a little bit of revision of one or two other things so that you understand where I'm coming from when I talk about certain things. The very first thing is verbal versus written leases. Now, I know in our world, well, I think in our world, we all work on written leases, okay? However, we've got to take into account that the Rental Housing Act says very specifically that a lease does not have to be in writing. So people can conclude a verbal lease. And we've got to be cautious as we go through this process that we don't erroneously, by accident, inadvertently conclude a verbal lease. So the principles of any contract has to do with offer and acceptance. So if you make an offer or the landlord makes an offer, but remember, we are the stand-in landlord. We are the agent for the landlord. So when we talk with landlord's voice, okay, so to speak. So if we make an offer and it's accepted, even verbally, there is an argument that can be made by the tenant that there is a lease in place, that their offer has been accepted. So one has to be very, very cautious if you want to avoid issues. And these aren't issues that are common, but they are issues that can be a total pain in the butt. I mean, I inherited a tenant once from another company. And I say inherited it, yeah, anyhow. And the tenant had been placed in the property without a written lease. And it was an absolute nightmare to deal with because what is the problem if there's no written lease? And the tenant has occupation or whatever, which was the situation in that case. The problem is that the terms and conditions are not clear. We all have our own idea. And the only things that can be specifically invoked or acted on are those few lease terms and conditions that are included de facto or by operation of law that are specified in the Rental Housing Act. So that can be very, very problematic, and it was an absolute nightmare. And why am I saying this? Because, for example, if the agent, and this is where we've all got to learn to be very cautious, because it's so easy to get yourself into a verbal lease. Let's put it this way. If you, for example, call the tenant and you say, fantastic, your application is approved, and they say, when can we move in? And they say the 1st. There's an argument that can be made that we're in a verbal lease, okay? And now you can't get agreement on the terms and conditions. You go backwards and forwards and blah, 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 blah. And there can be this issue, but they might still invoke. So it's incredibly important that we draw the line very, very clearly as to when the lease is actually initiated. I beg your pardon. Because that's when the responsibilities and obligations kick in. And I know I'm not using technical legal language here because, yeah, it's easier just to speak plain English, so everybody understands. So it's very important for us to make sure that we don't end up in a verbal lease situation, even though, and especially when the Rental Housing Amendment Act comes in, if I recall correctly, leases have to be in writing. So then life might be a little bit different. But at this point in time, they don't have to be in writing. So if we make an offer to a tenant and the tenant accepts the offer, there can be an argument that there is a lease in place. And then the obligation, for example, the obligation of the landlord is to then offer the property to them. So we've got to be really careful. And I know this might seem trite, but can become problematic if we're not pedantic. And yeah, I know I'm a bit overly pedantic sometimes. I just want to see, there's something in the chat. Okay, there's a question that says a written lease is valid upon signature. Upon which point would a verbal lease be valid? A verbal lease would be valid as soon as an offer is made verbally and an acceptance of that offer is conveyed verbally. So when we're dealing with a written lease, we give them a written offer and they accept that written offer by simply accepting the terms, signing, initialing, etc. You know, that's so easy. It's black and white, and printing is black and paper is white. So it is very, very black and white. The problem with the verbal lease is people can be under a misunderstanding, and that's why we're going to that segs nicely into what I'm going to do now, which is the application approval overview. For those of you that haven't done my rental application training, this is sort of just a quick summary of the acceptance of the application or the approval of the application, where I cover my butts. So the very first thing is, when in my standard operating procedure for rental applications, I'm very, very pedantic about only approving applications conditionally, okay? And it's conditional on two things: the payment of the moving costs and the signing of the lease. And that makes it very, very clear that the only time when this lease is now operational, okay, is when the lease has been fully signed. Now, let's have a look at a letter out of that pack, because as you know, my SOP packs, sorry, I'm just trying to think while I talk. My SOP packs include all these communication templates as well. So my rental application successful letter template. And for that, I will send out a link where you can purchase it. But I did, just while we're on this quickly again, I did do a rental application masterclass for Expello in January. Okay, that recording is available for free. Just pop me an email, Shaunluyt, SHAUNLUYT.coza, and I will, and that's compliments of Expello, by the way. Then you can go through that training, but the pack needs to be purchased. So why, I think I've explained why I do this, why I draw the line, but let's just have a look at what I say. So we are pleased to inform you that your application to rent the above property has been approved, subject to, this is where I come into this conditional, payment of the moving costs and both you and the landlord signing the lease. So that they cannot come back later. Oh, no, sorry, we're dealing with people. They can come back later and say, we didn't understand this. But I can then go back to them and say, or if they take me to the rental housing tribunal or anything, I can go and say, but look, this is what I sent them. And it's very, very clear that you are approved subject to payment of the moving costs and signing of the lease by both you and the landlord. So I draw a very black and white line in the sand, that only when it is signed by both of you. In other words, I'm saying here that we are working purely, I'm making it very clear, we only work on a written lease. Although it might not be a requirement, that is how we are working, okay? So let's not worry about the moving cost. That's a discussion on its own. However, as soon as payment has been received, we'll draft the lease agreement and you and the landlord will need to sign this. Please note, until the lease documentation has been fully signed, we will continue to market the property and to accept and process rental applications. Very, very clear. We are not beyond the point of no return. The point of no return, the point when you can say, phew, I have a roof over my head, is when we have a signed written lease agreement. So that, in my opinion, takes out any ambiguity. And that has often been the situation where if there is, if you do get into any problems as we move forward, you know, things like, no, I don't like that clause in the lease. I want that clause changed. I want this taken out. And they think that, yeah, but we've been approved, so we can move in. This is where you can fall back on. Remember that a lot of what we do, guys, is not 99% of the time, we probably don't ever have to fall back on it. But it's that 1% of the time that we have to fall back on it, that we are so thankful that we have done this. Because you can get into, if you start getting into disputes here, it can become a very, very messy situation. And you might think, but Sean, why are you dealing with all of this while we're going through the onboarding? Because I think it's critical to the onboarding. You can get a nightmare onboarding. You can be stuck with a nightmare situation if we don't work pedantically and carefully. So, conditional approval. Then the other thing is warning that only the fully signed lease agreement terms will be binding, no verbal arrangements. Okay, if you have a look in most lease agreements, the lease agreements say very clearly in there that this agreement contains all the terms and conditions that are binding, etc., etc. Any verbal warranties, representations, etc., that are not included in the lease agreement shall be no force of or effect, something to that effect. Basically, the lease agreement would normally say, the written lease agreement would normally say, when it's signed, it would normally have a term that says, this is it, okay, this is it. So it's important that we make sure that anything that was important is included in it, because it will say, this is it. Anything else that was discussed that wasn't included in this lease agreement is not applicable anymore. And the advantages of working on this process, as we've discussed, is the dangers of a verbal lease agreement. And I suppose we can really say here that it may not be a binding verbal lease agreement. You know, verbal is a chamosh, eh? Verbal's a mess. But the dangers of people thinking that they have a lease agreement. And once again, we go into that thing about communication and us being on a different level or having a different understanding of this whole process than people that only do this once every few years. And then I do have the rental application standard operating procedure. I mentioned that already, so we can skip that. I will send out the details when I send this out. So now that we've set that as the scene, so now you'll understand when I say certain things, where I'm coming from or the starting point I'm coming from. Anybody got any questions about that before we move forward? And the reason I ask that is so I can have a sip of coffee. Okay, so now let's talk about the onboarding process proper. The onboarding process that I'm going to go through is the lease agreement, critical, because this is the governing document for any dispute, for anything as we go through it. We don't want any issues with this lease agreement. Then we talk about preparing the property for move-in date, often something that creates issues. And I'll give you some of the philosophies or some of the principles that I work on to try and avoid issues, okay? The ingoing inspection, we're going to focus quite a bit on that because once again, critical, I say critical a lot. Key handover, the snag list, and a post-entry inspection. And you're probably going to think, what the hell are you talking about, Sean? We'll get to that. So let's talk about the lease agreement. Firstly, I don't know, have you ever had the situation where you now are at the situation of you've approved an application, okay? And you've approved the application, you've notified the tenant, you've done it conditionally, so we know that we're safe here. Now you prepare the lease agreement and you send it to the landlord for signature. And now all of a sudden the landlord says, oh no, but I don't agree with that clause. Okay. And the common one that I used to have quite often is, no, I want this taken out about that the tenant can cancel on 20 business days notice. Then I'd have to have this whole discussion about, but unfortunately we can't take that out because it is a natural part of, not a natural part, it is enforceable by law. Okay, so we can't take that out. But the problem is you're now having that discussion under time pressure because everybody is now stressed and everybody's now putting you under time pressure to get that agreement signed. Because the landlord in his mind has already decided there is agreement. They don't understand. They don't understand necessarily. And I'm not making people sound stupid here, but they don't necessarily understand that we have communicated with the tenants that we have to have a purely binding lease agreement. So we've got to communicate that with them as well. So, and the other option is once the landlord has signed or once the tenant has signed, and you send it now to the tenant, or when you send it to the tenant, they might now start saying, but wait, I don't want this clause, I don't want this clause, I don't want this clause. So what do I propose? I propose that with the landlord, we include acceptance of our terms and conditions with our mandate. When we're signing up the mandate, we are not under this time pressure in terms of, I've got to get the lease done now, because remember, quite often this is 1 or 2 days before move-in date. So we don't really have time for all this. Well, I shouldn't say we don't have time, but you know what it's like. They want us to sort it out now. They want it quick, but this is the document that is going to govern this whole relationship between the land. It's going to be a fallback document when we come to things like disputes, etc. We can't just muck around with it. It could be that any of the changes that are required, you might need to pass by your lawyer, because we aren't lawyers. I mean, we're expected to know lots about the law, but we're not lawyers. So what I propose we do is that when we send out the mandate on the landlord side now, when we send out the mandate, we include a copy of our standard terms and conditions, and in your mandate, you get permission from the landlord to sign, and I think we spoke about this a little bit in the landlord onboarding series, to sign and accept your terms and conditions. Now we are clarified. If we have any queries, we can deal with them calmly at that point in time. Okay, and then we have clarity and we're all sorted. And if there's any special conditions the landlord wants in, we deal with that. When we send out the application to the tenant on the tenant side, okay, we then also include a copy of our standard terms and conditions, and we get acceptance from them as well. So let's have a look at that T046, I think. Oopsie, I didn't open it. Okay. So when I send out the application form, in my covering letter, I say to them, attached, please also find the lease terms and conditions. These are the only terms and conditions on which we are allowed to contract. Then in the application form, okay, and I know I'm going back a little bit far. In the application form, so, here's the letter, which says, we've also included our standard lease terms and conditions for your perusal. Please note, sorry, I must highlight this so that you can see where I am. Please note that in terms of our contract with the landlord, we are only authorized to prepare a release of these terms and conditions. If you have any requests for any changes to these terms and conditions, you need to include these in the application. This is the time when we can consider them. Okay, it doesn't say that, that's me talking now. This is when we can consider them. No request for alterations to the standard lease T's and C's can be considered after approval of an application. And you're probably thinking, Sean, why you're supposed to be talking about onboarding? This is part of the onboarding. This is the critical step of the onboarding. Why do I say that? Because, you know, we get these lease agreements, and this is the irony of the situation. We get these lease agreements from a lawyer or whatever, and we clarify terms, or we get it from TPN, or we get it somewhere. And then when a tenant wants to make a change, we quite comfortably write something there. Not understanding that sometimes we can be affecting the landlord's rights under law, the landlord's normal rights under law. And the landlord also doesn't understand this. So I'm very cautious with making changes to lease agreements. Lawyers have prepared these things. I'm not saying necessarily that they're cleverer than us. They just have a different field of specialization. They have cleared these things. And I am cautious of making changes. And I'm also particularly cautious of making those changes when we're at the point of a few days before, often a few days before move-in date. And if I'm uncertain about whether this change is going to affect the landlord's rights, I might need to consult somebody. So that to me is important. So I eventually decided to work very clearly on the fact that these are our standard terms and conditions. The same as any other company that you go to now, Vodafone, Vodacom, whatever it's called in this country. If you go there, they don't say your terms and conditions, and you say, oh, you know what? I don't want to put that. I don't like that. I don't like that. We don't get a choice. These are the terms on which we are making an offer to you to contract. And this is exactly the same thing. Remember when we are dealing with a lease agreement or when we're dealing with a new tenant or whatever, the landlord is making an offer and the tenant is accepting or rejecting that offer. That's really what it's all about. Contracts are about offer and acceptance. So the landlord, and this also goes back to the whole point about us being the experts there. So we advise the landlord, these are terms and conditions that we have spent thousands on, that lawyers have put together. We've got to be really cautious about changing these. So we deal with that when we're doing the mandate. And then when we come now to the application, we've got that already signed off. One of the most challenging parts of the job that I found was that until I changed this policy, let's call it that, of the company, was that we would get people wanting to change things. And all of a sudden I had to make decisions which I wasn't always comfortable with, and I wasn't always sure of the implications of. And as I say, the irony is we get a lease agreement from a company, and then we just somehow make changes, or the landlord somehow makes changes, and we're not sure. So I think we've got to be really, really cautious of that. And to go one step further, so we make sure when we send it out with the application form, the tenant gets the opportunity to read it in peace and quiet and ask any questions. But we also include acceptance in the application terms and conditions. So let's have a look at that document. This is all part of that SOP pack, by the way. So we talk about this, and then in this application form, if I can just find it somewhere, I just think it's easier to be black and white. Sorry, I just want to get to the acceptance. My apologies, I should have probably prepared this before. So first in the application form, we talk about special conditions. Remember when I spoke about that the lease normally says that once this has been signed, this is now the full extent of the agreement. Anything else that was spoken about beforehand now has no more standing. So in the application form, I talk specifically about special conditions. I beg your pardon that I've got a scratchy throat. If any representations were made to you regarding the property that are important to your rental decision, these should be included in the lease as special conditions. We're staying in control of this process, and that's important. That's important, as this is the only way to make them binding. Please list any special conditions you would like included. I deal with this as part of the application process. Why? Because if I've got 3 applications and one wants to paint the shower pink, wants to replace the bath with a shower, and I've had this now. They want to replace the bath with a shower, and the other one doesn't want it, then that's a term on which the landlord might not want to enter into an agreement. I don't believe in asking for requests for changes to standard lease terms and conditions. As far as I'm concerned, they are clear. And then, this is the acknowledgement I was talking about. We acknowledge that we have been provided a copy of the agent's lease terms and conditions. We understand that these lease terms and conditions are the only lease terms and conditions that the agent is authorized to enter into on behalf of the landlord. Clear. Sometimes I shift blame here. Now I'm like, sorry, messenger, don't shoot the messenger. This is my contract with the landlord, and it makes it much easier to have that discussion. This application will be processed on the understanding that we accept the standard lease terms and conditions. We also understand that no requests for changes will be considered after approval of the application. Guys, this makes your life so much easier. So much easier. And then this part I normally take out, by the way. I don't actually, it's just because some people want to allow changes. I think it creates too much work. And it creates us to take decisions that are above our pay grade. And I talk on behalf of myself. I'm not denigrating anybody else here. We understand that requests for changes to the agent's standard lease terms and conditions form part of this application and are subject to approval by the landlord. I think it's very important that we put that in. So hopefully that clarifies some things. Now, the lease agreement. When do we prepare it? I've spoken about requests to changes, and oopsie, let me not go too far. Are there any questions at this point that anybody has? I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm just going to carry on then. I hope that something I'm saying is making sense. If you have any queries, any questions, any concerns, please pop them in the chat. So, when do we prepare the lease agreement? I decided I would require full payment of moving costs before I prepared it. Why? The reason why, and this is part of tenant onboarding, by the way, because this is the critical part of tenant onboarding. Why did I require that? Because I found that too often I was getting stuck in a situation where we would approve an applicant, we would convey approval. Let me talk properly. Convey approval of an application to an applicant. We would then meet or we would then sign the lease agreement, okay, or we would sit down with the lease agreement, and let's say we got the lease agreement concluded. Now we are in a binding contract. Now, all of a sudden, there's now a problem with coming up with the deposit, and that's normally the most common one, okay? Or they don't pay my full fee up front. Now, my problem is that generally on most lease agreements, that does not bring the lease agreement to the end, or it doesn't mean that the lease agreement is not binding. It's binding still, they are just in breach. So right at the start of this process now, I have to say to the landlord, even before they've moved in, I have to say to the landlord, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord, I'm really, really sorry, but they haven't paid their full deposit, okay? And so I've given them a 20 business day notice, because normally we're talking about a fixed term lease agreement here. And that's not the way to start off a relationship. But the only way the landlord can actually get out of that is by putting them in breach and them sending an LOD and them not then fulfilling the requirements of the LOD. I got into that situation once or twice, and honestly, it's not a situation I want to be in with the landlord. So I make it very clear in my application process, give me the money, honey, then we sign the lease agreement, okay? And that works for me. We spoke about requests for changes to the lease agreement, and we spoke about special conditions. Another thing very specifically I make sure is that, and we'll do special training on lease agreements. We'll talk about occupant details. Now, another question, who signs this lease agreement first? And I have clients who do things both ways, and I can see advantages both ways. Firstly, one common thing that I've learned, I know the acceptance, or I think the accepted procedure, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I tend to see that most people will send it to the tenant first, get the tenant to sign it, and then send it to the landlord, okay? I'm not, that's how I used to do it, so nothing wrong with that. But I can't tell you how often when somebody will call me and they've got a dispute, and I say to them, okay, send me a copy of the lease agreement, that the landlord hasn't signed it. It's unsigned by the landlord. So I've got the impression, and I know out of my own experience, that often the landlords are the tardy ones to sign it because they don't realize it has to be fully signed. So I have some clients who do it the other way around. They send it to the landlord, get the landlord to sign it, and then they send it to the tenant. Then as soon as the tenant has signed it, we have a binding agreement. Okay, and the tenant is now officially now a tenant. And I actually think there's a good argument for doing that, because that means that as soon as the tenant is after all the one that wants the roof over their head. So I think that there's quite a good argument for doing that. So I say you can do it either way around, but that works for me, because then the tenant is the one. And after all, we are talking, remember when we spoke about contracts, we talked about the fact that we're making an offer and there's an acceptance. So that this fits in with that philosophy where we make an offer. the landlord's making an offer in detail to the tenant and the tenant's accepting it. So that actually quite makes sense. Beg your pardon. Now let's talk about the communication regarding the lease, okay? And this is when we talk about the lease agreement for signature, and we send it to the tenant for signature as well as to the landlord. And that's part of this SOP that we're talking about. And so I have, and this explains to them specifically, okay? This explains to them specifically about when the lease will become binding. Because once again, remember, we are trying to communicate and make sure that everybody is on the same page here. So we are being very pedantic about this. So it explains to them that it will only become binding once both people have done this. Now, check in the signed document. You once again, you won't, you know how often I get lease agreements that are not fully signed, etc. And what is that? That gives people an out, because they can say, oh, but it's not fully signed. It's not fully signed. So as part of this process, and let me just go back to my process. Where am I? I'm sorry, I get confused because all these things look the same in my little tabs. I prepare the lease documentation. We send it, in this case, it's the tenants first. When it's returned, we must check each page. We've got to check each page and then get any problem solved. And when we send it to the other party, we do exactly the same. Then we come to the point of terminating the marketing. I'm not sure when you terminate marketing, but I found that often people get so excited when an application comes in that they somehow terminate the marketing. And guys, I don't believe that's working in the best interest of our landlords, okay? Because that system, although I know I've said the onboarding process starts there already, but I only am past the point of no return when I've got the money and I've got the lease agreement fully signed. So I only propose terminating the marketing once we get to that point. And then importantly, we send a copy of the lease agreements to each party. And I think that's critical when we come to lease agreements. Now, there's a few things that I just want to cover in terms of the Consumer Protection Act and lease agreements, which is something that we deal with the Consumer Protection Act a lot when we're dealing with early termination and those sorts of things. But there's a few things there. Now, one of them, the very first thing, is direct marketing and the cooling off period. I don't know how many of you apply that. And that's that thing that says that when somebody's entered into an agreement, and your lease agreement as well as your mandate will normally have a tick box that says clause 16 of the Consumer Protection Act applies or doesn't apply, okay? And so they have this cooling off period. And a lot of people, and I've seen it being invoked, and I've experienced it being invoked where the tenant says, no, but I've got 5 days to cool off. Not necessarily. And to be honest, very, very seldom when it comes to a lease agreement. Very seldom. It has to be exceptional, because direct marketing in terms of the Consumer Protection Act is defined. It says to approach a person. To approach, we've got to do the approaching, either in person or by mail or electronic communication, for the direct or indirect purpose of promoting or offering to supply any goods or services, or requesting a donation. Well, donations would be lovely, but they don't give us donations now. So direct, when we put an ad on the internet for a property, it is not direct marketing, okay? So that means that it's very unlikely that the direct marketing cooling off period actually applies when it comes to a lease agreement. And that is a very common misconception. I've heard agents also say, yeah, no, but the tenants have got 5 days cooling off period. No, only in the case of direct marketing. Only in the case of direct marketing. Then we get to the other Consumer Protection Act. I just wanted to talk about a few things here. We get to the other one, of the right to information in plain and understandable language, and that's section 22. So, and the information means our communications, that means the lease agreement, it means all those sorts of things. But you will, I know when we read the lease agreement, we're not always so certain if that's plain language now, but you will have noticed that lease agreements over the years have changed. They used to be full of that legal gobbledygook, that Latin goeters, but it's very seldom that we come across that now. So I think that has probably been dealt with in most lease agreements these days. It doesn't have all those Latin terms in it. So those are this cooling off period. A lot of people believe that, and we've got to be really careful here, because should we accept a cooling off period request from a tenant, and should the landlord then argue that, and the landlord now loses money because we misunderstood this direct marketing thing now, and the landlord now says, no, but you shouldn't have done that, or the landlord goes to his lawyer now. Sorry that I'm saying no so much. The landlord goes to his lawyer, and the lawyer says, no, but that doesn't count. The landlord could theoretically sue us for any loss. So we've got to be really, really careful. And this is something that I think, the potential of us getting sued for things is so, so high. I know most people out there don't understand what we do, and that's our fortunate part. But the CYA thing of mine, and I'm not going to say the words again because I got into trouble once with the A part. Okay, now we're going to talk about request to move in early, but I see there is a question. So let's see what it is. Somehow, I'm not quite sure, but I think I misunderstood that. Hello, Lane. Request to move in early. Do you get these often? I'm just going to have a sip of my coffee, which is probably cold. But do you get? I assume you get these often. Beg your pardon. I know we used to get these often. Okay, can we get the keys the day before? Can we move our stuff in a little bit earlier? We won't move in. No, we won't move in. Can we just move our stuff in a bit earlier? My short answer to that is unfortunately not. Okay. We used to get these requests a lot, but once upon a time, many moons ago, and I have many moons behind me, as you can probably see, but once upon a time, many moons ago, I had an issue where the keys, or I can't remember if I can't actually recall it so many moons ago, whether the keys were given to the tenant or whether they were actually allowed to move in earlier. When I say move in earlier than the date in the lease agreement. Earlier than the date in the lease agreement. And something happened. I think it was just a matter of the keys being given. There wasn't an arrangement. And something happened and the property was broken into. Okay? And it became a bit of a mess. Because the problem was somebody else had the keys, and now we got involved in an issue, and the issue involved insurance. So I think it's incredibly important to make sure that everything is documented as it happens in real life. So, and this just has to do with the fact that if somebody else is walking out there around without keys, and we're talking, I said insurance implications there. What I mean by that is now the insurer finds this out, and they love to make an excuse not to pay things there. So I don't give permission I didn't allow permission to be keys to be given. Keys get collected from the office, signed for, etc., on the date of, no, sorry, not signed for, collected from the office. I'm talking nonsense. They get given to the tenant after the ingoing inspection, and that's the first opportunity they have to move in. If they would like to do it, and I have included it in the tenant letter, okay, that I include in the standard operating procedure, explaining to them very clearly that the move-in is permitted at this and this and this time, on this and this date, or after the move-in inspection. And if you want it earlier, we have to document it in the lease agreement. And we can either document with a special condition saying that they will be given permission to move in, or the landlord has agreed and it's all agreed, Okay, because that, remember, is also when this risk and responsibility shifts, because now they've been given occupation. So if we end up with a problem, house burns down, break in, etc., we know exactly where the risk is because they've been given occupation. Remember, when the key, just giving keys because people can go in and out and measure stuff and stuff like that, is not actually as simple as that. It has implications, because as soon as we give them the keys, we're essentially giving them occupation. And occupation is important to document, so that if we end up, and I know once again the chances of this happening are scattered, are minimal, are small, but it's not about the chances, it's about when it happens. It doesn't happen only 1%. The whole happening happens, and it is a mess. It is a mess, and I remember having a nightmare with this. So that's when I started being very strict about this. I'm sorry, I do not have permission to do it. And if there is going to be permission to do it, then I want to document it in the lease agreement so the landlord does not come back to me afterwards. Because remember, this is also a problem, that the landlord is under the impression they're going to move in on the 1st, and now by accident, not by accident, we give them the keys the night before. They go in that night, something happens, and now I end up with the gebakte pere, as they say in Afrikaans, the baked pears. I can't remember what the thing is in English. So my advice is everything should be documented in the lease agreement. And remember, this is the landlord's business. The landlord is entitled to charge for any additional days, even if only the keys are given, because I actually personally don't believe that people only take the keys and only move in a few boxes. But let's say they move in a few boxes. Let's just before I go on to that last point there, let's say they move in a few boxes now, and they don't actually move themselves in. But the night before the lease happens, their boxes are stolen, or the day before, or whatever, their boxes are stolen. Now they involve us now in a dispute, and the landlord's saying, yeah, but it's, or the landlord's lawyer says, yes, but it's not in the lease agreement, and the landlord's insurance says something, and the tenant's insurance is not worth the aggravation. It's honestly, I try to keep out of aggravation. I try and have something that I can go back to where I can say, but I'm sorry you didn't have the permission. And the easiest way is to say, I'm sorry, I can't give you the keys unless we change the lease agreement. So once again, as part of this process, and I did write it into where we send out the document to the tenants, and I just want to see if I have that here. I don't think I have it open. Sorry, I have too many things open. But I make it very clear that they can only move in after the ingoing inspection. I think that is incredibly important. So even if only the keys are given, the landlord is entitled, because keys equals occupation, essentially, really. And the next part is preparing the property for move-in day. And we're going to get involved in some CPA stuff there. There's quite a lot in the CPA that we only generally really specialize in, that early termination. But I think that is, we're going to start there when in part 2 of the training. Excuse me. So I'm actually going to end here. So any questions? I've just had a question saying I need more detail on the cooling off period. One of my clients moved in and within 5 days requested to move out. The cooling off period is if there was direct marketing. Now let's, I think it's section 16. Let's just go back to the Consumer Protection Act quickly. And I will make this a bit faster. By the way, I like having this thing in PDF, because what you do is you can normally go Control F and then just search on a word. But let me just find this cooling off period thing, and I'm sure it's number 16. And I'm not clever that I remember number 16, but it's because I copied and pasted it for this presentation, which is the only reason I remember 16. The only one I normally remember is 14. Okay, the consumer's right to a cooling off period. Okay, So it says, a consumer may rescind a transaction resulting from any direct marketing without reason or penalty. So if they were directly marketed to, and a very good example of this is normally this timeshare thing there, where they call you, they invite you to come to this thing, you can win a prize, which of course nobody ever flipping wins, and all that sort of stuff. And it's almost like a bit of a pressurizing thing. You have an ideal example is what's called telemarketing, no? When you call in these people and you say, oh, by the way, I've got a property, would you like it? Oh, it's lovely, no? It's lovely. I just called to find out if you'd like this property, blah 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 blah. But this is what's got to initiate this transaction. If somebody's, for example, contacted you and said, listen, I'd like you to let me know about any rental properties because I'm looking. That's different, not direct marketing. They've contacted you. It's when you have contacted them, okay? It's when you have contacted them. So let's have a look. And the reason I say that, guys, is because when we go back to the definitions, and I'm not clever, it's just that I work through this nonsense. I shouldn't say that. No. I work through these things as part of my preparation. Then I say, okay, well, let me read through this act again because maybe I misunderstood something. Direct marketing means to approach a person. We have to approach them, not put an ad out. We have to approach them. To approach a person, either in person or by mail, which would never get there, or electronic communication for the direct or indirect purpose of offering, promoting, or offering to supply any goods or services. Goods obviously being a rental property as well. So by promoting or offering, so we have to initiate that. That is the only time, and only then will they have a 5-day cooling off period, in my opinion. Of course, if somebody wants out of, this is now the legal side there, but now if somebody does want out, the purpose is you're going to have the only way, in my opinion, and I believe we have to be very strict on this to protect our landlords. If they want out, 20 business days early cancellation is the only legal way, in my opinion, for people to get out of a contract if they've changed their mind, whatever. And it's important for us to invoke this on behalf of our landlords, because that way we are protecting our landlords, and we have a fiduciary obligation to protect our landlords. If we don't protect our landlords and we somehow, I can never think of this word, man. It somehow negatively affect their rights, because remember, with a early termination, the tenant has to give 20 business days notice. It means they're responsible for rent up to that 20 business days. I beg your pardon. They're responsible for the rent up to that 20 business days, and potentially for a reasonable cancellation penalty. If we just say, oh, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord, it was direct, the 5-day cooling off, the landlord then finds out that, or speaks to their lawyer, or speaks to someone who says, no, man, it's direct marketing, and this wasn't direct marketing, and the landlord's now lost out on that potential income, we can be held responsible because we put ourselves out there as the experts. So that is important. So I just want to just have a look. Okay, so that was the detail on that. Sorry, there's a few questions. Access to the documents I was using. I will send out 1 or 2 of these as part of this. The others will be available for purchase as part of the standard operating procedure as the pack, because my standard operating procedures are a pack. How can we get a recording of this call? I have recorded, okay, and because I know not everybody can attend to it, so what I will do is I need to just edit it. Give me a few days. I will get it uploaded, and you will be emailed as soon as that is available. With regards to the request to move in early, you mentioned the lease agreement must be amended. Can we do a separate? Yeah, you can do a separate document. If it's something that you get a regular request for, and I think it is something we can do regular requests for. I try and avoid it, guys, and let me explain to you why I try and avoid it, because these things often happen at the last minute. So I try and make it clear from the start that it doesn't happen, okay? And the other thing is, the next section that we're going to be talking about is preparing the property. I find that often we go back to that thing of us trying to be nice, okay? And we feel sorry for people. And I don't say we shouldn't lose our humanity, but we feel sorry for people, and we end up putting ourselves in difficult situations, making ourselves liable, and often creating their own month-end stress. So we could do a separate document that is an amendment, and then I think, but make sure there's one thing here, okay? Sorry, the question that I got here was, with regards to the request to move in early, you mentioned the lease agreement must be amended. Can we do a separate document that is an amendment? Yes, you can do a separate document. And if it happens often, you can have it very clear. But I think in that document, you must make clear that they are now taking occupation. You need to speak to your landlord about whether your landlord is going to require money for this. The landlord is entitled to require money for this because it's their property. And after all, this property is not for free. So we need to talk to them about whether they require money, make sure that the landlord's going to have to sign this in any case. We also need to make sure that the property has been prepared, the ingoing, and this is the stuff that I haven't got to today yet as part of the thingy, as part of the procedure. The ingoing has been done and everything is sorted. All our T's are crossed and all our I's are dotted. So we could do you could sort of have, if it's something that happens often, you could have it. But the other thing is they must understand that they are now accepting the risks and responsibilities that go with occupation of the property from the moment they fetch the keys. The landlord is no longer responsible. And look, it's only happened once in my life. But I try and not, I try and avoid these situations, because when it happens once, it can be a nightmare. It can send you off to the loony bin. You can have a mental breakdown. Okay, another question. Would the term direct marketing apply when we are canvassing, calling sellers or landlords to get their property with them? I believe so, yes. But that would be direct marketing mandate, okay? Because when you are calling sellers or landlords to get their property, yes, you are marketing directly to them. And they would then, in my opinion, as a generalization, have a cooling off period. But the cooling off period is the contract entered into between the agent and the landlord. So that's a 5-day cooling off period because you direct marketed to them. It's with the lease agreement that there is often a misconception, and I've seen tenants getting out of lease agreements due to this reason. You're welcome, Elise. Thank you. Can the owner take advantage of the 5-day, another question, 5-day cooling off period and not have any implications? In other words, take the tenants out within 5 days, seeing that 99% of the time we direct cold called him. The landlord can take advantage of the, take the tenant. No, no, the cooling off period does not. Okay, we're talking Consumer Protection Act here. So let's just once again talk about Consumer Protection Act talks about a supplier, okay, a supplier and a supplier and a consumer. The supplier, in this particular case, when it comes to a lease agreement, the supplier is the landlord. The consumer is the tenant. So the only person who has the benefit of the 5-day cooling off period, should it be applicable, is the consumer. So if we're talking about going to that question about the landlord and us direct marketing to the landlord, in the case of a mandate, the landlord, the agent is the supplier, the landlord is the consumer. So the consumer, the landlord, in the case of a mandate, the landlord, if there is any benefit or cooling off period, the landlord has the advantage, not the agent. If we are coming to a matter of the lease agreement, the supplier is the landlord, the consumer is the tenant. So the person who would have the advantage of any particular, if it is applicable, of the 5-day, and I know I'm being pedantic, the 5-day cooling off period is the consumer, in other words, the tenant. So my understanding of the question I got here was, can the owner take advantage of the 5-day cooling off period and not have any implications? In other words, take the tenants out within 5 days, seeing that 99% of the time we direct cold called him. No, the landlord can take advantage of the 5-day period. If we called the landlord and we concluded a mandate, the landlord can take advantage of that if they change their mind. But the landlord cannot take advantage, because the landlord in the case of the lease agreement is the supplier. Only the consumer has the advantage of this, because I don't want to sound trite when I say this, but it's the Consumer Protection Act. So we've got to remember it's the consumer that's being protected. So in a lease agreement, we have landlord, supplier, tenant, consumer, so only the tenant can. However, on a practical note, let's forget about the law now. Sorry. On a practical note, if a tenant wants out, okay, they're going to become, in my experience, or in my opinion, not experience, my opinion, an absolute nightmare if we don't let them out. An absolute nightmare. So you can have a discussion to with your landlord about, and you can remember, the landlord can still let them out by mutual agreement. We've just got to be so careful that we don't mislead the landlord and say to the landlord, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord, under the direct marketing section 16 of the Consumer Protection Act, they've got a 5-day cooling off period, and they've invoked this, so I'm letting them go. I'm sorry. I'm letting them go, and then the landlord later on finds out that that's not actually applicable, and that we actually should have followed and required the section 1420 business day notice. And so now the landlord's potentially lost out on that 20 business days worth of money, as well as a potential reasonable cancellation penalty. Sorry, these are unprepared answers. Reasonable cancellation penalty. And they say, oh, no, you misled us. You didn't. You misled us, so now I'm going to claim that money from you. And I think they have a right to do that, or a right to attempt to do that. Once again, a nightmare. But if they do want, I'm quite happy, and I would practically have a conversation with the landlord where I say, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord, these people want out. They have no right. This cooling off period, in my opinion, and I've sought legal advice or whatever the situation is, I do not believe they are entitled to it. However, do you really want this nightmare? Do you want somebody there who doesn't want to be there for whatever reason? And the landlord may decide, yes, that they want to hold them to the 20 business days. That's perfectly fine. It's not our property. It's not our income. Okay? We have to take instructions from our landlord. That's why it's a mandate. And then we have that discussion. And if they decide that they're fine with it, of course it can be terminated by mutual agreement. Get the landlord's permission to do it in writing, and we move on and we find another tenant who's happy there. That's absolutely fine. Doesn't mean we're not allowed to do it. Just means protect your butt by getting it in writing and making sure you explain it to the landlord properly. And that has actually made me think about that in this, and this is why I say that standard operating procedure is not available yet, because I'm just actually thinking, I'm going to make a note here, that the standard operating procedure, I'm going to put in a letter for 5-day cooling off. Sorry, I'm just making a note, and now I'm trying to write and talk at the same time. I haven't got it in there, but I think it'll be handy to have it in there so we protect ourselves. And we say to the landlord, this is what's happened, this is the situation. If you want us to continue, please give us this permission in writing. Cover our butts, cover our butts. And we also say, we also have some letters to the tenants. I will write some of those. I'm not a lawyer, so I will try and get some clarity from 1 or 2 lawyers just to double check that what I'm writing is clear and what I need to cover in it. But I think I'll do that. And that's why the SOPs are ever evolving documents. You are welcome. Thank you for the positive feedback, guys. I've gone over my time. I hope and trust. Oh, wait, let me actually get back so I can actually see you all. There we are. Okie dokie. Sorry, I was talking to my screen there, so I'm back now. Any other questions, please feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I'm going to bid you all adieu.
Thank you very much. Very informative, and we'll see you next time.
You're most welcome. Oh,
Thanks, Sean.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Jan. Oh, Jan, it's you.
Yes,
Sorry,
it's me.
I've got my chat box open here. If guys, if any of you want to, you're welcome to go into audio now because I'll cut this bit out at the end. In any case, so if anybody wants to talk, you're welcome to. You're welcome to show your face. Thank you to everybody who's saying thank you, guys. I hope you got something out of it. It was sort of a bit weird as to where I draw the line between tenant onboarding, but I decided to be comprehensive. So hopefully it has helped explain some things.